Welcome to this year's Advent Talks, entitled Ancient Promise, Radical Hope, exploring the Advent Antiphons. Yesterday we entered the season of Advent, the season that marks the beginning of the new church's year. Very often we think about Advent as a season of waiting, and that is right. But this is not the idle waiting we encounter in works such as Samuel Beckett's Waiting for Godot, a futile marking of time that allows for no real hope to break in. It is true that some of us have experienced this kind of waiting through the various lockdowns we have had to endure this year. Lockdowns that have left many of us feeling anxious, depleted, and unsure as to what the future might be. Authentic Advent waiting, though, is about taking time to dwell with promise, to begin to encounter our world in a new way, not as a closed system incapable of newness, but as radically opened out to the movement and purpose of God. Advent waiting is a waiting on God, an expectant looking for his coming among us to challenge and transform us, to provoke and to heal us, to judge and to restore. During this season, the coming of God has a dual perspective. Cyril of Jerusalem puts this double aspect of God's coming into our world beautifully in his catechetical lectures. He says this: "There is a birth from God before the ages, and a birth from the Virgin at the fullness of time. There is a hidden coming, like that of rain on fleece, and a coming before all eyes, still in the future." Advent, then, asks us to focus on these two comings. The first, God coming among us in the vulnerable flesh and wild crying of a tiny baby. The second, God coming as a searing fire, recasting the cosmos in beauty and justice. This year, throughout Advent, we are focusing on the 8 Advent antiphons to sharpen our sense of just who this Jesus is, whose advent into our world changes everything. These antiphons, sang liturgically in the last week of Advent, in the lead up to Christmas at evening prayer, beautifully frame Mary's song of freedom and liberty, the Magnificat. And each of them reaches far back into the traditions of the Western Church, being in common use in the 8th century, and with reference made to them as early as the 5th. The antiphons themselves consist of evocative Latin prayers, all invoking Christ and calling upon Christ to come to us and save us. Each begins with a plaintive cry, and each conjures up ancient and elusive titles for Christ, drawn out of the ancient memory of the Old Testament people of God. O Sapientia, O Adonai, O Radix Jesse, O Clavid David, O Oriens, O Rex Gentium, and O Emmanuel. And in the medieval tradition, in the English nation, an 8th antiphon was added to the Blessed Virgin Mary, O Virgo Virginum, the gateway of Christ's very coming among us as the Word made flesh. Each of these antiphons draws upon the prophetic works of Isaiah, the poet who speaks most powerfully of exile and return, of judgment and hope, of the people's failure and God's renewed promise. In Isaiah, the history of Israel, finding itself time and again lost in the wake of foreign imperial powers, is reimagined in the light of God's creative and compelling action in that history. Even as historical trauma and international politics threaten to close us off or shut us down, God is still radically on the move, opening out our history once more to judgment, justice, and truth. This is why these antiphons are so powerful for us, as they ask us to reimagine our own stories, whether personal, national, or global, as stories in which God's coming can be known, a coming that is endlessly surprising, endlessly disjunctive, and endlessly creative. Our first antiphon that we will be considering today is O Sapientia. O wisdom, which camest out of the mouth of the Most High, and reachest from one end to another, mightily and sweetly ordering all things, come and teach us the way of prudence. In an amazing essay entitled The Question Concerning Technology, Martin Heidegger, the famous German thinker who wrote Being and Time, says this: technology is no mere means. Technology is a way of revealing. It seems that for Heidegger and others, our contemporary way of being human is a technological way, a way that sees the world as a resource to shape and use for our own purpose, to produce, to categorize, to dominate and control. But wisdom, as drawn out of our scriptural tradition, is not to be seen in terms of analysis, scientific knowledge, or the technological control of our world so much, but rather in terms of delight and desire, of the giftedness of our world, of the relationships that form it, of our intimacy with it. This is how Gregory of Nyssa, one of my favourite 4th century theologians, puts it. The word dawns upon a soul full of love and desire. And since it is wisdom who speaks, love her as much as you are able, with your whole heart and strength. Desire her as much as you can. Be in love with wisdom, when she bids us to be in love with the divine beauty. In the wisdom literature of our Hebrew scriptures, we are told again and again that the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. This is not a fear based in anxiety or produced by threat, but rather an awe and wonder that causes us to tremble as we contemplate the deep mystery of ourselves, our world, and our God. Wisdom just is this delighting in mystery, a delight that leads us into worship and wonder. We also find an intimate connection between wisdom and knowledge and righteousness and justice. Proverbs says, "Then you will understand righteousness, justice, and uprightness, each pathway of good, for wisdom will enter your heart and knowledge be sweet to your palate." More than this, society and the cosmos itself are seen as contexts of structure and meaning, of beauty and relationship, of mystery and depth. And we find that wisdom is universalist in scope and international in flavour. Perhaps the high point of contemplation on wisdom in our Hebrew scriptures is that of contemplation on Lady Wisdom. Here is a poem to Lady Wisdom, found in Proverbs chapter 8. Look, wisdom calls out, and discernment lifts her voice. At the top of the heights, on the way, at the crossroads, she takes her stand. The Lord created me at the outset of his way, the very first of his works of old. In remote eons I was shaped, at the start of the first things of earth. When there were no deeps I was spawned, where there were no well springs or water sources. Before mountains were anchored down, before hills I was spawned. He had not yet made earth and open land, and the world's first clods of soil. When he founded the heavens, I was there. When he traced a circle on the face of the deep. When he propped up the skies above. When he powered the springs of the deep. When he set to the sea its limit, that the waters not flaunt his command. And he strengthened the earth's foundations. And I was by him, and intimate. I was his delight day after day, playing before him at all times, playing in the world his earth, and my delight with humankind. In this passage, wisdom is linked to Torah and Logos, and becomes the guiding principle of creation. And here God and wisdom play together in creative innocence and delight, shaping the world in love and joy, and offering that same playful creativity to all humankind. This figure of wisdom personified is beautifully taken up in our Gospels and applied boldly and imaginatively to the person and work of Jesus Christ himself. In the prologue of John, we are told, "In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was in the beginning with God. All things came into being through him, and without him not one thing came into being." As Logos and wisdom, the Word is active with God and as God in the creation of all things. But more than this, he comes to tabernacle with his people, living in our very flesh. But as Matthew's Gospel reminds us, this Jesus Christ is wisdom dressed in rags, homeless and exiled, finally dying on a cross outside the city walls as a condemned criminal. In the most radical reimagining ever, the wisdom that emerges from the Most High, mightily and sweetly ordering all things, now is to be seen only in Christ, our crucified and risen Lord. As the Apostle Paul writes, "For Jews demand signs and Greeks desire wisdom, but we proclaim Christ crucified, a stumbling block to Jews and foolishness to Gentiles. But to those who are called, both Jews and Greeks, Christ the power of God and the wisdom of God. Come, O Christ, and teach us the way of prudence." The second antiphon that we are considering today is the O Adonai antiphon. O Adonai and leader of the house of Israel, who appeared in the bush to Moses in a flame of fire and gavest him the law in Sinai, come and deliver us with an outstretched arm. Our second Advent antiphon speaks of Christ again, this time as Adonai or Lord, the Hebrew word substituting for the unsayable name of God himself. Who is this Lord whose coming we long for? Can this be the coming of God himself? Clues are given to us in the second part of this antiphon, as it is indeed this Lord who appears to Moses at the burning bush and gives the law at Sinai, the God of the ancient people of Israel. It seems that in this Jesus we can begin to discern the presence and purpose of Israel's God himself, the God of exile and exodus, the God of creation and recreation, the God of homecoming and return. And we are called upon to remember these ancient Exodus stories with imagination and faith. Never mere history, these are stories fraught with theological significance, prophetic texts that tell of the creative and salvific action of God in our world. We're to use these stories liturgically, to enact them, for we are contemporary players in this ancient drama, with an Exodus-shaped God who frames and inspires people of faith today. The same God who answers the existential reality of a people who cry out, wherever they may be, trapped in the habitations of darkness, longing to be free. This Exodus God exhibits a passion for justice as the one who responds urgently to the people's cry from slavery. In those early chapters of Exodus, he is the one who hears, remembers, sees, and takes notice. And the encounter between Moses and God at the burning bush is, of course, a pivotal one for the people of God. And it is evocatively portrayed in terms of a bush that burns and yet remains unconsumed. There is something here about divine passion and desire, a passion that burns with endless creativity and energy, but a passion that is not destructive in its force. In the text itself, this is the burning passion for life that will be set against Pharaoh and his armies, the cosmic embodiment of slavery and anti-life. And in this encounter at the burning bush, God speaks of his identity in two seemingly contradictory ways. He speaks of himself as the God of your ancestors, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. This is a God who anchors his activity into the life of his people. He is a God who nurtures and sustains relationships of trust and vulnerability. A God who himself can be trusted as he gives himself over to his people. Secondly, and more enigmatically perhaps, he speaks of himself as I am who I am, or I will be who I will be. We can see in this mysterious epithet a twin movement. First, it speaks of coherence and stability. This God is being itself, eternally abiding, impassible, simple, and unmoving. But this God also is the power of the future, a passionate freedom that is endlessly on the move, like a fire or a raging river. Here is a God who is in himself dedicated and committed to the free-flowing powers of life and generosity, both within himself and unleashed in creation. This God will make this commitment available to us, his people. More than this, it is this God who gave us the law at Sinai. We often think of the law in narrow, moralistic terms and as something cut off in the ancient past, but we couldn't be more wrong. Instead, we should see the giving of the law as that which enables the shape of Israel's life together, laws that are shaped by their experience of freedom and liberation in terms of the Exodus itself. As Brueggemann reminds us, it is the law that creates the possibilities for an Exodus-shaped people. As we move from slavery to freedom, from a diminished vision of who we are to a vision of the human person fully alive, as we make that painful move from injustice to justice and from sin to forgiveness and freedom, we need new signposts of how to live together. In the Exodus, God's people have been brought into a new orbit of life and of blessing, and it is the Torah, the law, that now orientates them in their new life together. Simply put, Torah is that which orientates us in love, first to God and then to our neighbour, and it is worked out in lives lived in holiness and in justice. Come and deliver us with an outstretched arm. The last line of today's antiphon makes it clear that we are not able to deliver ourselves from the situation we find ourselves in. Just as in those ancient stories of Exodus, Israel cries out to God in their slavery and distress, and he hears, remembers, sees, and takes notice. So now God hears our cries of distress, and he answers them decisively in the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus Christ. Indeed, his death and resurrection is our exodus, lifting us from those places of death and raising us into the life and joy of heaven. Brueggemann says this: the authority of Jesus, his power to transform, is found precisely in his own poverty, hunger, and grieving over the death of his people. In his poverty, he had the power to make many rich. In his hunger, he had the capacity to fill others. In his capacity to grieve, he had the power to bring joy and wholeness to others. In his person, which was a non-person in the eyes of the pseudo-kings, he had the authority to give futures to those who had none. Thanks be to God, that his coming in Christ breaks into every place of darkness, defeat, and death, and that this coming is not one of judgment, punishment, or penalty, but is rather a sign of his endless compassion, his exuberant forgiveness, and his recreative purpose. Come, O Christ, and deliver us with an outstretched arm.